All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We're really excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate monogamy in this economy, finances, child rearing, and other practical concerns of polyamory with Laura Boyle, the author, in conversation with Libby Sinback. You can probably tell by how I read that title that I love that title and have been making sweet jokes about it all week as I pass by the book. So I'm really excited to get to celebrate this book with all of you. Tonight's event was supposed to be a hybrid event. We were going to get to celebrate in the store, but for folks who don't live in Atlanta, we're having some inclement weather from the hurricane, and so we decided to go all virtual. So we're bummed that Laura can't be here with us, but Libby and I both live in Atlanta and made the judicious call to not imperil Laura by bringing her to Atlanta this time. But we do hope to have you come to Atlanta in the future, and we're really glad for all of you who were intending to come in person to the store. Thank you for signing up to watch virtually. We're really glad you're here, and we think we can have a lot of fun with virtual events. So please be warm in the chat. Shout out where you're watching from. Maybe shout out your favorite polyamorous economic issue that happens in your household or your polycule. Give us a lot of warmth. There's a lot of great emojis you can use. So we'd love it to feel as if we're all in the physical room together, because we're a little bummed, but we're gonna have fun tonight. So first, I'm gonna introduce Libby Sinback. Libby is a relationship coach, educator, and host of the podcast Making Polyamory Work. She helps people who want to live and love outside the status quo break out of the harmful relationship patterns that are holding them back from nourishing, authentic, boundless love in their life. Libby believes love is why we are here and how we heal. So welcome, Libby. We're glad you're here.
I'm happy to be here.
And
I'm sad I'm not in person. I love Charis.
I know, we're sad you're not here too, but we'll
You're like right down the street from me.
Yeah. But the woman of the hour is Laura Boyle, who is a relationship coach, educator, and the voice behind the blog at readyforpolyamory.com. She's also, as well as the accompanying podcast. She's been an expert voice on the topics of polyamory and parenting for the Boston Globe, The Economist, Parents Magazine, and Cosmopolitan, as well as being polyamorous herself for nearly 20 years. Her coaching practice is largely focused on helping non-monogamous folks through major life transitions, and she's based in New Haven, Connecticut. So this book is hot off the presses, and it's we were joking that it's not a super sexy book. It's a very practical book, and sometimes you need a very practical book to have a sexy time. So that's part of what we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to get out of the way. I want to encourage folks to ask questions at any time. You can put them in the chat early if something occurs to you as you're listening, and then Libby will help integrate them into the conversation as we go on. So welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being here. We're really glad you're here.
Thank you for having us. So I wanted to start by thanking you guys for being here and thanking Libby for being here with me, and saying that I am bummed that I couldn't come down to Atlanta. The weather has foiled us, so unfortunately you get to see me cutting close with a little bit of my office window behind me, and I thank you all for bearing with me through the virtual version of this event. I'm going to start by reading just a little bit from the introduction of the book to sort of explain a little bit about what this less sexy of my available writings is.
I think it's very sexy.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And just to note and give Libby credit where she deserves it, Libby is the one who wrote the foreword to the book, which is also very sexy. And I'm going to be reading from the first chapter, starting on page 18. So if anyone already has a copy of the book and wants to read along, because I know that generally helps me when someone is reading to me to follow along. I'm starting about a third of the way down the page at the heading, Who is Polyamorous? And I'm just going to read a little excerpt, and then we're going to get into our conversation about the book. So Who is polyamorous? Everyone. Well, about 5% of everyone. Studies show that within North America, the only demographic along which one can predict a propensity to non-monogamy is age. And it's not exactly age, it's that Gen X and baby boomers have a lower percent of non-monogamy than millennials and Gen Z. Race, education, whether you live in a city or a suburb, a blue or a red area of the USA, had no significant impact on your likelihood to have been part of a non-monogamous relationship. About 21% of adults have tried non-monogamous relationships, and between 4 and 5% identify as currently part of one. A 2023 YouGov survey confirms the overall number. 6% identify as completely non-monogamous, and breaks it down along the generational lines I laid out above. A good chunk of these polyamorous folk have kids and cohabit. It's harder to gather good data on this because polyamory is not a protected status, and so folks are less willing to share the details of their relationships and private lives. Folks who do not live in homes with more than 3 adults often use the appearance of living in a normal couple to allow them the legal and structural privileges that come from doing so. These include things like not running afoul of zoning rules or of landlords who only want to rent to a traditional family, as well as the over 1,100 federal laws that come into effect upon marriage in the U.S., many of which affect inheritance, taxation, and health benefits. Legal advocacy for polyamorous families in the U.S., which will come up as it affects the households we talk about in chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11, has been focused on the most visible of these rights: health insurance, child custody, renters' rights, and inheritance. Part of the process of normalizing non-monogamy and polyamory in the public eye has been repeated media profiles of folks who live in household groups of 3 or 4. This has honestly become a stereotype that the polyamorous and broader consensually non-monogamous community decries. We aren't all thruples who nest is a TikTok that I've made, and I'm not the only one by a long shot. But these families are the first public face of non-monogamy that many monogamous folks encounter. The polyamorous family. As noted, not everyone lives in households with their partners, their metamors, partners, or some combination, but as I'm going to explain in more detail below, these are the families I focus on in this book. There are plenty of social scripts for living as a couple, or a family built out of a dyad with kids. Increasingly, there are good resources for step-parenting, for blended families of remarried monogamous parents, but when there are more than 2 parents involved and there are effective bonds, when parents are emotionally, sexually, or intimately involved, there are no resources, there are no social scripts, and the reaction that folks get can be very negative. A significant portion of my coaching practice is about helping folks navigate combining households, both internally among themselves and with children if they have any, and externally with family and friends, especially monogamous friends. There's enormous variety in polyamorous households, including whether they like the term polyamorous family to describe themselves. And I've done my best to try to represent some of this variety and give you options and scripts to take with you into the future of your non-monogamy, whether you choose to follow them or not. So that's just the little, what am I doing with this book? What's the point? Who is this for? Of the book. And I know I like to joke that it's my unsexy book, and it's my unsexy book because I'm not writing about, how do you decide who it is that you're sleeping with and why and where? Well, where a little bit I talk about. But it is talking about the practical part of it and what those practicalities mean for all of us. And I think that's actually kind of important once we get down to it.
Well, and Laura, I want to lift up something that I want, that you said at the very beginning when you pulled out the statistics of who is actually polyamorous. And what really, I just wonder, was it surprising to you to find out that polyamorous people cross the political spectrum, cross all geography, locations, whether it's cities, suburbs, rural areas, race, class, etc. Was that surprising to you?
So I'm going to be honest, the reason that wasn't surprising to me is that I've been in the kink community for so long that if kinksters can come from every possible background and every possible,
right,
in my opinion, voting against their own rights, orientation and set of beliefs, so too must non-monogamous people, right?
Totally.
So for me, it's that kind of no relationship style or set of choices and values around how we relate is necessarily aligned with any other portion of our identity. So for me, it just kind of made sense that just like queer folks must come from every walk of life, so too must non-monogamous folks.
Right. And we're everywhere. And I just I really wanted to appreciate bringing that out, because then of course, it's not that there's this weird subculture that exists over here, right. It's we're embedded in the world just like everybody else.
Well, and I think it's important.
And I thought that it was also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think it's important that they're doing studies that make this explicit. Yeah. Because when I came out to my parents, they were very convinced that this was me and 5 people I knew doing something very strange, out in the woods somewhere. Not literally in the woods, but me and 5 people in Montreal doing something very strange, because I was living in Montreal at the time. Right? Okay. So it's me and 5 Canadians doing something very weird.
Well, I mean, you just said it all right there. You're Canadians, so yeah.
Right? And so...
Sorry, no offense to any Canadians in the audience. I love Canadians.
But in fact, being able to make it clear that not only was it not just me and a handful of youthful weirdos doing something, but that this is wide-reaching, that there are people of every age who are doing this, that there are people living every which where, has actually been really important for an increase in understanding, right? And not just with my family, although yes, with my family. I think the point where I could start pulling out studies was actually a little bit of a turning point with them. But I mean, so was the point where I was reading Dr. Justin Clardy's book, Why It's Okay to Not Be Monogamous. And my dad went, oh, there are PhDs working on this now? Let me see. And read it when I set it down for an afternoon, read it in, 2 days. And he was like, that was actually quite good. Your people are doing good work.
Well, and
the academic snobs can also appreciate us,
Well, and there's a task force in the American Psychological Association now that's organizing around this and doing, like you said, real research. A lot of people are doing academic papers on this. And then there's your survey as well that is the basis of your book. And I think it's important to just note for people who aren't familiar, this book is rooted in a significant amount of data, actually.
Right. So I did a survey where I got... I put out a survey, a 10-question survey, and I asked for folks who were currently or had previously lived in households with 3 or more adults who were connected by these affective bonds to answer. It was a pretty simple survey, and the last question on the survey was, would you be open to further interviewing on these subjects? If you are, please give me a form of contact, right? An email or a phone number, so that we can follow up. And I got, of people who filled out the form correctly, so every question was answered, and none of the answers were gobbledygook, so it wasn't robots or anything. 462 complete answers.
Wait, so I'd pause there for a second. 462. I just want to acknowledge, I've seen research papers with 10 people, 9 people, 45 people, but you had 462?
Yes. So I was very lucky. I got a number of my colleagues, both researchers and influencers online who are involved with the non-monogamous community to mutually share this, right? So researchers like Dr. Elizabeth Sheff shared this, and also polyamorous influencers like Leanne Yao of Polyphilia blog, all shared this for me.
Yeah.
And as a result, I was able, leaving this open for a period of 3 months, to get this sample, right? And I got this sample, and then I started doing follow-up interviews. And it took me many more months than the 3 months to do all of the follow-up interviews. But I talked to more than 150 people in follow-ups. Between Zoom calls and emails and phone calls, there were people who walked me through their house. A couple of people had their kids steal the iPad in the middle of the Zoom call. I had a very memorable call with a 3-year-old carrying the iPad through the house and mom chasing behind her going, "No, give it back." Right? So like a wide variety of different kinds of information that came back to me, because what I want is to make explicit the information that we often keep extremely private about our relationships, how we organize our homes, how we organize our finances, the difficult conversations that we have that are really what make and break our relationships.
Yeah. Well, and because when we're talking about just in the public world, like I even think about this as, you know, my positioning in the world, which, you know, I'm publicly polyamorous. Like if you want to find out whether I'm polyamorous or not, it's not hard to find it out. But at the same time, I'm aware that like, depending on where you live and who your social connections are, it might not be something. I would say the majority of people are various degrees of not out, you know, not sharing that with everybody. And so we just don't know. We don't have a picture of what it looks like to share a home. And people always are asking me when I do share, because I live with 2 adults. I live with my spouse and his other partner. And it boggles people's minds, you know, because they don't have a frame of reference for it. And so I really, really think it's just so wonderful that you've like not just taken your own personal story, although I think that's wonderful too when people do that, but like you're really taking an aggregate of just like what this can look like you said, to normalize it. I remember when my mother-in-law was, and I put this in the forward, when my mother-in-law, you know, when my spouse's other partner, who was partnered with me at the time as well, moved in with us during COVID, like right when it started. She was her biggest question, which she couldn't even ask either of us. She asked my mother, was, "Who sleeps where? Where does everybody sleep? How does that work?" And I was like, that doesn't seem like the most important question, but it probably is the question. I guess I'm curious, like, is that a question you get a lot too when like people are asking you?
I used to live in a V, and when I did, that was a question we got all the time. So do you all share a room? And we didn't, right? We had 2 similarly sized bedrooms that we used as like equally master bedrooms, just because that was what was convenient for us, and the hinge floated back and forth.
Oh, wait, can you define hinge for folks?
I will. So yes, so a V is a relationship where 2 people are dating the same mutual partner. That mutual partner is the hinge partner, right? We're like drawing the relationship like it's a door joint, a door hinge, and the shared partner is the hinge. You could say like hinge partner and spoke partners. We draw things and then we give them names, right? If we're drawing polycules, relationship networks, we get to come up with really funny names for them. So that's a V. And then if you add a 4th person, you can make it an N, or you can call it a Z. We can make them W's, and then we can make them conga lines if you continue having sets of 2 partners. It's fun. Sorry, I have a sense of humor about this where I get a little silly. I apologize. But when I lived in a V, the hinge partner used to go back and forth between our 2 bedrooms and didn't really have a room of his own, but he had like half a closet in each room. And so we would very carefully, when putting away the laundry, make sure that he had some of every kind of clothes in each room so that there wouldn't be a like first thing in the morning running back and forth between rooms to get dressed situation. Not because that was a problem. He was both our partner. He could come in, but in case either of us had another partner over, he wouldn't be interrupting them, or he wouldn't have to negotiate what that felt like. right?
Yeah, while not having a pair of pants on.
Yeah. And like that's the kind of space use thing that I end up talking about in here, because lots of people expressed that the relationships with partners who didn't live with them were the bit that they hadn't thought about. They thought a lot ahead of time about what their relationship was like with everyone who was going to live in the house, but they didn't think ahead about what the larger relationship network looked like or what it might look like, because they're all polyamorous, as they continued dating. And then the space use concerns of those adults continuing to date and what those interactions might be, or what the interactions are of people who lived in the house choosing to host or not host, or have people over or not have people over, at what kind of interval, are the sort of things that folks don't always consider in advance, but are nice conversations to have had at some amount of advance notice.
Right. Well, I see the flaw in the Hinge not having his own room is, what if he had a partner he wanted to bring home? Where would he go?
Right. So at our house, a few years in, that became a situation. And what ended up happening is that one of us would end up having to stay on the couch so that he could use one of the beds, or there would be like inflation of air mattresses. There would be a world of situations that didn't seem very reasonable to me at the time. And this was because for the first time in many years, he had a partner who couldn't host at their place. And people never think of the possibility that they'll have a partner who can't host, even though the situation is that they're a partner who can't host, because that's what they've just generated, is a situation where they're a partner who can't host.
Yeah. So let's zoom back to the overall like different things you discovered in the survey and what you write about in the book. I guess I'm wondering, like, what was the most surprising bits of information that you got? Because I feel like, there's one that we both know about that we've talked about already. And
so I think my surprises show my biases, right? I think one is something that kind of comes up in that little introductory statement that I read, which is that I was really surprised how many people lived in groups of 3. I end up dedicating.
We don't all live in groups of 3. Oh,
right.
Wait, maybe a lot of us do.
Right. And I end up dedicating almost a chapter of the book to it, because 3 is by far the most common number of adults who live in a house after 2. And of the households where you have 3 adults, it's much more common for people to be living in a triad setup where all 3 of you are involved together, rather than a V setup. And like almost 2 to 1 more common. And
wow.
This, I didn't ask the questions to follow up on that consistently enough for me to draw conclusions about that.
Like the why that's happening?
The why that's happening. But based on the times where people expressed their thoughts about that, and the things that I see in other patterns in relationships, I would guess that it's a bit about the way humans in general have a tendency to forgive their partners more easily than to forgive people they're not in that kind of loving relationship with. So you have a slightly easier time of making do and getting by with people who you're giving that little bit of extra grace to.
Yeah.
And so households where everyone's got that romantic relationship to one another in have a little bit less resentment and a little bit less friction.
That's interesting, because I think that's such an important part of your book too, is like, a lot of this is about how do you live well with someone. And I just want to name, like, living well with someone's pretty challenging, you know, because there's just so many places where you can collide. And I think that is possibly one reason why we tend to cohabit with romantic partners is because there is that love, the ooey gooey love to kind of grease the wheels when things are hard.
Right. It's a buffer. It's like an extra lubricant to our interactions.
But I have a thought about the 3 people thing, just because from my experience, I think it is because it's so hard to find people where everything lines up enough where you can successfully cohabitate, where you want to be in the same general location, you have the same idea about how a household should run, you have the same idea about how you want to use
getting bigger gets even harder. Yeah.
Yeah, the more people you have, the more compromises you're having to make. So it makes sense to me that 2 + 1 would be like the easiest to land with.
For sure. I talked to one group of 7.
Wow, I was going to ask what was the biggest number that you found?
That seemed mostly like it had started as a roommate situation that went spectacularly well, and over time people had begun dating.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And just a couple of people had left, and a couple of people's partners had moved in to fill in the gap over the years. And so as a result, this house had stayed at 7 people, 6 of whom were involved for several years. Wow. And so, like, more power to them, but I could not fathom managing that many connections on that level. And so the other sort of big thing that I say that's a surprise to me was actually not a surprise in doing the survey. Well, it was a little bit of a surprise in doing the survey, but it was more a surprise in doing the research to see if the survey matched with things that were known in the research. And that is that chores are one of the top reasons that people separate in relationships. So lots of people were citing chores as like their primary relationship difficulty, or figuring out the balance of chores as the thing that almost wrecked their relationship, or things like this. And then I was looking to see if there was good research around equitable division of chores or things like this. And I found so much research about monogamous relationship breakdown due to chores, but so much.
Well, it's such a big part of the discourse right now, too. Well, I feel like I'm seeing this being talked about more because, like, it's usually around gender disparity.
Well, and so it felt to me like even though I had lived in a polyamorous household with 3 people where the division of chores was challenging, this was somehow shocking to me, because I guess I thought that I must be special and my experience could not possibly be the average experience. But it was a little bit shocking to me the degree to which this was a thing. And with chores, this idea of folks not just feeling like the labor was unequal or whatever, but also like social expectations of what their home should be like, of how the labor should be divided in their home, of who was owed what. Right, and of who was owed what in terms of both how the house is, how their free time is.
Well, and also probably how much money they're making, and so labor they're contributing to outside the home versus labor they're doing inside the home.
Right, and the way that all played into different people's experiences, there were a lot of patterns in how that played out across many, many people's expressions of different relationships. And so I end up giving that a lot of page space.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious if I know that, folks are either have read the book or are going to read the book, but I'm really curious, like, did you find any particular things that people who were doing this well, like any kind of common threads where this was going really well?
So figuring out which things people can't stand doing and giving them to other people. Not making people do their most hated option or taking it away from them as like a gift to your partner is one of the like most cited, this is how we keep the house running smoothly things. And if absolutely everyone hates a chore, putting it on a schedule where it's rotated and not making it that one person is always taking the resented, terrible, whatever job.
Right.
Considering the organization of jobs to be its own job. That is not always the duty of one person or if it is the duty of one person because either they like it or you've all collectively decided that they're better at it, whether for socially determined reasons or because they're actually better at it, giving them credit for having done that.
So that's like the mental load, right? Like really taking the mental load, like the person who's in that manager role of making sure stuff gets done, that gets acknowledged as a job.
Right. Acknowledging it as a job, even if it's just that like they're making the every 2-week list of which things need to happen and who's actually doing it and assigning out the roles, that's a job. And they get credit for it.
That's my job in my house. And people do, I do get credit for it. It goes well because I get credit for it. Like people appreciate me for it.
Because in households where people don't get credit for it, that builds a higher level of resentment. Acknowledging that as polyamorous people, having many hands should make light work, but might not because we tend to have a higher level of expected social time. So we might actually have less time that we're allocating to chores.
Wait, say that again. So what were you saying there about like there's an expectation of like many hands make light work?
So when you all move in,
it doesn't.
3 people, there's this like expectation that, well, there'll be 3 of us, so it'll be easier. But if you also think, but all of us have this expectation that we're polyamorous, we're going to be out and doing things and still dating each other and whatever, your social free time expectation is also higher. Gotcha. And doesn't account for the housework time that has to be put in the first place. So being realistic about what your actual time necessary to get the housework done is, and factoring that in before you start doing the rest of your calendaring. Right? And factoring in time with partners, including your nesting partners, as separate from chore time.
Yeah, that's a big one. That is such a big one that I talk about a lot.
Because people who just go, oh, nesting partners get leftover time or incidental time often end up with nesting partners who only get like chores and cooking. And chores and cooking can be fun, but often it means that you feel a little bit stagnant. You feel like you're missing things that other partners aren't getting.
Right. You need to still plan dates. You still need to go out and do things together or plan that intentional time. Yeah, I think it's like there's this assumption that all that household time is like, just that's quality time, and it's not.
And folks with kids especially tend to feel that way because trying to manage household duties and things for kids and social time.
Yeah.
As a parent who doesn't really have a life right now between work and my kids and managing household stuff, I certainly recognize that like the balance can be very challenging, and date night might be like, oh, we spent exactly 2 hours going on a nice walk and getting a cup of coffee. But like, we got out of the house and we went together to the park with our cup of coffee. It was meaningful.
Well, yeah, let's talk about kids because that's a big part of the book too, right? Like being a household with kids with more than just 2 parent adults. And I guess I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about that. Like, I mean, I guess there's like the question of like, what does it even mean to be a parent in that dynamic? I mean, I've gotten that question a lot on my side. Like my spouse's partner, people always ask me, well, what do the kids call them? And they use they, them pronouns, so what do the kids call them? Who are they? And I'm like, they're here. That's who they are. But I'd love to hear like, what your survey found, what your book found.
Well, mostly it found that people don't agree about what a parent is. Okay. And that you need to be really intentional with your partners about what you mean when you're letting partners into your children's lives, right? Mm-hmm. So if you already have children and you're integrating partners into your life and into their lives, talking with your co-parents and talking with your partners about what actions feel parenty to you. Right? Does it feel parenty if their parenting is the wrong word. Parental. That's the word that's not sticking in my head. Does it feel parental if they're
parent
if they're enforcing rules that you set? Or is it only parental if they get to make up new rules? Or is it a parental threshold if they've been spending a lot of time around, so they're chipping in for groceries, right? Does that mean that they're a parent now because they're helping feed the kids?
Right.
If they make dinner once a week, are they a parent now? Most people would probably say no, because the babysitter might do that too. But there's lines, right? And so you have to figure out where your line is and which of these roles feel parental and which of them don't. And is it only when you talk about it? Is it like, there was a family who I spoke to who had very heavily demarcated what was parental and what was not parental. And it mostly came down to, did people chip in money for the children, and did they get to make medical decisions? And if they were not allowed to make medical decisions and they didn't help pay for daycare and after school activities, then they were not a parent. Because these kids already had 3 parents who had had a breakup, and now 2 of those parents were adding new partners. And so they were like, okay, these new partners might be taking on like emotional and caretaking and physically present roles, but they are not going to be parents, because we've already done like very intense decision making around how our separation is working and who is parenting these kids. The kids are close to these people. They have deep relationships with them. We want to encourage that, because more loving adults is better. But
yeah. Well, and I think that you can make this distinction between parent and caregiver. And that's what we've done in our house. For sure, Kier hangs out with the kids, does stuff with the kids, has a relationship with the kids, but they're very clear that they're not a parent.
Right.
And they draw the line like way more strongly. Like they enforce our rules, but they don't make new rules.
Yep.
They definitely wouldn't make a medical decision for the kids unless it was an emergency.
Sure.
But you know, it's a tricky thing, I think, for them. I think I think it can be a tricky situation when you are an adult who's not a parent, who doesn't have that decision-making power, but the decisions that the parents make with the kids affect you.
And there are lots of people who spoke to me while I was doing the survey who were like, it's really hurtful that we live in this situation where I can have been parenting a kid for however many years, and I don't have a sort of really good recourse to become the legal parent of this child. Or where this and that situation can be such that even with medical powers paperwork in place, it still feels a little uncomfortable if I'm alone with the kids for too long or whatever, right? So there are all these workarounds that are becoming more available. There are places where slowly rights for polyamorous people are becoming enshrined in law, right? There's domestic partnership paperwork available in a few cities. There's non-discrimination paperwork that's or laws that are available in a few cities. It's slowly spreading. I say slowly, but it's the last 5 years, right? So that's pretty quickly, actually.
Yeah.
And that's just not enough for it to be like, well, in a landslide, this is all going to become available. And those of us who are raising kids with 3 parents, like me and my co-parents, are suddenly going to be in the clear, and our families are going to be equally accepted all over the world tomorrow. That's just not that likely. But for now, we live in a really liberal state. We're out to all the kids' teachers. We're out to all the kids' doctors. We've never had a problem. We're doing paperwork because we live in a state where third parent adoption is possible. We're in the middle of doing that paperwork. So one of my kids is my biological child and one isn't. So we're looking at putting the opposite moms on the opposite kids' paperwork. And we're hoping that by this time next year, we'll have all of that done. But like, it's expensive and complicated and not ideal.
And not available to everybody.
And not available to everybody by a long shot. Right? So even people who have been doing, as we have, raising kids from when they were infants, don't have all of these opportunities available. And for most people, it's a lot like step parenting. You kind of make it up as you go. You figure out where your boundaries are and what kind of feels appropriate for both parents and children, and be ready to adjust if it doesn't quite feel right.
Well, and that's what I want to say is that actually this isn't that new. This isn't that different from step parenting, except that everybody's likes each other a whole lot more. Although there's so many stories out of like, step parent, like where the biological parents have split, but everybody's friends and everybody hangs out. Nobody's dating each other. It's like two monogamous couples. Yep. But it's funny how, like, in fact, there was a content creator on Instagram who was sharing like how we go, oh, this is so wonderful that these people can all get along and have this nice blended family. These two couples, they've split, but they're still on good terms. But then when you look at a polyamorous dynamic where something very similar is happening, it's like, that's horrible. You're just, you're doing something terrible. You're harming the children.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is just a very like sex negative culture thing, because people assume that polyamorous people must be doing something horrible in front of our kids, right? Because culturally we can't admit that people can have multiple relationships, which we assume must include sex with multiple people, in a way that won't negatively impact our kids in some way, right?
Right.
Because we think that people who must be doing that must have horrible values and must have horrible judgment and therefore must be being inappropriate.
Fortunately, we have research that disproves that.
Exactly. And none of that is true, but these are all the assumptions that we all run up against.
Yep.
And it stinks. But also, the best sort of medicine to that is making sure that people actually meet polyamorous people in real life. Which is part of why I end up opening with those statistics, because there are so many of us and we're just not out most places.
Yeah. Well, and I want to appreciate that you do share a lot of stories in the book. And I guess I'm wondering if there's any of stories in the book that are just like, if there's one that's like your favorite, like, or not your favorite, because I don't want you don't have to pick your polyamorous, but like, is there a favorite that you just like, you love the story that you shared?
Well, okay. I think people did really, really clever things with organizing their houses. So there was a triad who decided that because they had moved into an old house and it didn't have enough closet space, that they were going to give up the idea of having separate bedrooms in order to turn one of the bedrooms into a full walk-in closet. And they just put a piece of furniture in there that was convertible enough that if they really needed to, someone could sleep on it, right? But they made it like a closet dressing room situation, but just it had one of those big chairs on it so somebody could nap in there if they needed to. And then they shared the other bedroom instead of trying to have a guest room. And I thought that was cute and clever. And then not one, but two households who owned their homes decided that the master bedroom had too good an ensuite bathroom to leave it private to one bedroom, and knocked an extra door into it from the hallway so that people wouldn't have to walk in through someone's bedroom to have access to the good bathroom. And
I love that.
I thought that both that was cool in terms of sharing space, but also it's funny that it happened twice.
Right.
And it must have happened more than twice if it happened twice in 150 something people who I talked to.
That's pretty remarkable. I want to pause here and just notice the time. And I'm checking for questions, but I don't see any showing up yet. So I just want to let people know, if you want to ask a question, we have 15 minutes left, right? In our conversation.
Please feel free to ask us your questions. If you don't ask any, we will just talk.
We'll just talk. But I will interrupt us. Yeah, exactly. I will interrupt us for questions. And one question that's coming up for me that we haven't talked about yet, but that of course is a big topic that we're only going to be able to touch on is dun, 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 money.
Yes.
How do people, like, what did you learn about how people handle money? Because that's another big reason why people break up and struggle.
So people do money all kinds of different ways. And my personal favorite is sharing much of your money, but keeping some of it to yourself, right? Joint some of it and some of it kept for yourself, and figuring out how much you put into a joint account for household expenses proportionally. So somebody asked, are there new financial benefits for polyfamilies and unions? And there's no like specific polyamorous benefits as far as I can tell. However, if you're living, there's all the like economies of scale you can have as a polyamorous family. The biggest like problem that polyamorous people had overall when I was talking to people about finances were not being able to agree what a joint expense was, which I think also happens for monogamous people. But for polyamorous people, there are additional wrinkles that come up, like, are dates joint expenses? Are dates only joint expenses if they're for people who all live in your house? Right. Are vacations joint expenses? Are vacations only joint expenses if they're only for people who all live in your house? How do you decide who's paying for what?
Well, and right? Kids too, that would be another one, right? Like, are kid expenses only for the two parents, or is that shared across everyone in the household?
Right.
Yeah.
And so like kid expenses and whether everyone's paying them or not, and people having multiple accounts for different ways that things were divided was really common. And also people who had previously had a joint account as a couple and then moved in with additional people, making a like more joint account for the new household, and then keeping their previous couple's account for like kid expenses if the other person wasn't planning on being a full parent yet, or if they were integrating that slowly, was relatively common.
Yeah, that's what we do actually. Like we have a like a family bank account for like kids and co-parents, and then we have a household bank account that's for the adults in the house, where we pay the mortgage, where we pay utility bills, where all of that comes out of it. And then we have a credit card attached to that account that we all can use for household expenses. And then we have, you know, like a separate, we have stuff separate for different buckets for different things. Yeah.
Right. Because like most people agree that rent or the mortgage, utilities, and like maybe cars, if they're shared, are household expenses. Cars are the first thing that people start to argue about.
Really?
Because if people each have their own car, and depending how rural you get, right, even like where I am, usually every adult has their own car. And so then, well, it's your own car, it's your car payment, it's your gas, it's your oil changes. It becomes a whole thing. You get to decide. There's some great questions here. So
I'm seeing a couple questions. So I there was one in the Q&A section, and that one came in first. So it said, did you notice any interesting processes or structures for decision making among more than two people?
So I didn't see anything sort of new, but there were people who tried really hard to avoid triangulation by making sure that they were all present for any big decision making. And I found that to be a pattern that was common among successful or longer standing households, right? I also found...
Can you define...
go ahead.
Can you define triangulation? Like what do you mean by triangulation?
Oh, sorry. So by triangulation, I mostly mean people who are talking through a third party about each other or about their feelings about each other regarding a problem. So like, say when I was living with my meta and my partner, if I was annoyed with my partner about the way he wasn't doing the dishes, and I'd go talk to my meta about it instead of just talking with him.
And then the meta would go say, hey, by the way, Laura's mad at you about how you didn't do the dishes. And then,
Brian, Laura's pissed that you haven't done the dishes in 2 days. Can you please just do your chore? Right. So instead, it would be that everybody gets together and does the thing. Usually about things that are slightly bigger than the dishes, but you know what I mean.
Well, we have a bi-weekly family meeting that we do for that, for that reason. Like, we check in, we synchronize our schedules, we figure out who's going to cook what, we make a grocery list together. Yeah, I mean, and that really, really helps that avoiding triangulation. It also avoids like the other thing, which is I told one person, but I don't remember if I told the other person. I don't remember who I've told what. So like we have a shared group chat where we text each other stuff too for that reason, so that we don't lose track of what we've said.
Who you told what. Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think generally people sharing information openly and what's the other? Sorry, I have lost what the other thing I was going to say was.
Sorry.
Yeah, if you have a good other conversational or communication tool, I'm happy to have it shared. I just can't think of what it was. There weren't particularly things that are like better for 3 or more people than 2. It's just there's lots of particular conversations that are better when you're cohabiting that it's good to get out in front of that are in here. And it's not that they're tools, it's more topics and conversations to remember to have.
Yeah, which I think that this, I mean, in my mind, this feels like a book that could be good even for monogamous people.
Yeah.
Like, because I think that when you're monogamous, you just kind of, you cohabit and you just kind of assume everything's going to work out. But like, even defining what does it mean to be a parent with your monogamous partner, even defining how are we going to share finances with your monogamous partner? Because boy, howdy, does it get messy when you just assume we're just going to mash everything together and it's all going to work out.
Well, right. And I think even like solo poly people who have roommates would probably be well served by a bunch of these conversations. But yeah. And okay.
Well, yeah, that was another thing too. Yeah, it's just organizing multiple roommates of adults that are not necessarily romantically or sexually connected.
Yeah, except maybe the chapter on metas, I don't think any of it is particularly polyamory specific. Except that that's the lens through which I got the sample that the survey data came from.
Yeah.
And so did I notice a relationship?
We have another question here, which is, did you notice a relationship between the number of children households contained and the number of adults household contained?
Sort of. So the only households that had large numbers of children also had large numbers of adults, right? I didn't have any households that had like 8 children and like 2 adults. That was not, or 3 adults. That was not something that I happened to see, or people didn't disclose it if that was the case. But households that had, we used to joke when we lived in a V that we were always going to outnumber the children, and that's not quite the proportion. But it was sort of the proportion that there were relatively even numbers or fewer children than the number of adults, right? It wasn't usually more than 3 or 4 kids with the 3 adults kind of shape of households.
Well, and that kind of brings us back to the title, right? Like monogamy in this economy.
Right. How big a house can people afford too?
Well, and I was just also thinking like having extra adults makes all of this a little bit, like you said, it can make things a lot easier. You know, you're able to deal with economies of scale. You're able to share chores. You're able to share childcare. It doesn't always work out perfectly like that, I know, but like, I guess that's I guess I'd love for you to, like, as we're closing out here, maybe just say a little bit more about like how it is great.
Well, and I think sometimes the times when it wouldn't work out are the times when people wouldn't form a household that I would get to talk about anyway. I used to get people asking, well, are you just going to move in with everybody you date then when we were living in a V? And the times when that wouldn't have been feasible are like my now partner of almost 10 years and I, at one point talked about whether it would be feasible for us to move in together, but he lives in a triad and I was living in this V, and for it to be 6 adults and 4 children in a single household, the size of house you need to find to accommodate that many people comfortably is not a realistic sort of situation, especially given that all of us had household members in Connecticut, right?
Well, and you run into zoning problems too. There was that
right.
family where that wasn't an actual issue, right?
And so in our state, about 2 years before, when I was expecting my son, there was a lawsuit in the town where I went to law school, that I talk about in the book, where a polyamorous family was sued for basically living in a mansion around the corner from where I went to law school because they had too many cars parked outside. And so the neighbors looked into how many people lived there and then sued them for violating zoning. And it took them many thousands of dollars and a couple of years to resolve that. And they ended up resolving it in their favor, but only after spending many thousands of dollars and a couple of years fighting legal battles. And that's not a super appealing thought, that you have to town by town convince the town that you count as a family.
Yeah.
Like, that's not super fun. And so somebody has a question. Did you talk to many folks who are sharing resources and responsibilities across multiple households and different kinds of relationships? I talked to a few. One of my follow-up questions was, are you living in more than one household? And I spoke to 6 or 7 people who were living across multiple households in a split time kind of situation. And so I didn't get a good representative sample of that. But most of the time they were doing that because they were trying to equalize types of relationships, not because they thought of it as different kinds of relationships, but because they had partners who were not compatible for living with one another, and they were splitting their time between those partners. And then, did many people I talked to divide financial burdens according to relative economic privilege? Yes, a lot of them did, and I included a breakdown in the book of the most common way that folks did that. I'm sorry, I'm not going to go through like a numbers breakdown because it's just going to sound like gibberish when I'm doing it on screen, but I include like 2 examples in the book.
Which, speaking of, I think we're
sort of running low on time. Yes, so we are supposed to call ER back in to sort of MC us out. I appreciate all of you so much for being here and talking with us, and Libby,
and thank you for your good questions,
chatting with me.
This was so good. Thank y'all. There's so much more in this book, so we know folks are going to want to buy it. You can click the teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy the book from Charis. It really does help us when you buy your book right there in the center. So go ahead, click that button. If you had friends that you think would appreciate this event, let them know. It's going to be up on YouTube in a few days. They can also register and just watch it on Crowdcast right away. And we would love for folks to come pick this book up in the store anytime. We have a very large polyamory section in the store, probably the largest in Atlanta, if I'm guessing. And so if folks have never heard of Charis and are here because of Laura or Libby, we would love for you to feel welcome and affirmed by coming to Charis. So come see us and see our large section of books. And yeah, so I hope everyone who's in Atlanta stays safe and well throughout the country, wherever the bad weather is. And I'm so glad that we got to do this with you, Laura, even though it's not quite what we initially envisioned. This is great, and I know lots of people got to enjoy it tonight. So thank you.
Well, and my lights flickered a few times, but we kept power, so that's great.
We did it.
Yes. Thank you both. Take good care. I appreciate you.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah,
Bye.
thank you, ER. Thanks, Charis, for having us, and thanks, Laura.
Bye.